Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Some stories are whispered about in dimly lit kitchens, behind drawn curtains, in voices that barely rise above a breath. They are the kind of stories grandparents bury beneath silence, the kind of truths that never make it into newspapers or history books. Tonight, I want to share with you one of those stories. It begins with a wedding that should never have happened. A marriage that was less about love and more about bloodlines tangled so tightly that the family tree became a closed loop, suffocating itself. She was old enough to have known better. He was young enough to have been her grandson, and yet somehow the town let it happen. They dressed up, they smiled, they poured drinks, and they pretended not to notice the grotesque joke playing out before their eyes. But underneath the laughter, there was something festering, an unspoken knowledge that this was not a wedding but a confession of what the family had been hiding for decades. The woman was known in the county by her maiden name, though that name itself carried weight. Whispers of an old Appalachian bloodline that never mixed with outsiders. For generations, cousins had married cousins, uncles had taken nieces, and children were born with faces that mirrored one another too closely, eyes that seemed to carry the same vacant stare. People said it was tradition. People said it was survival. But behind the locked doors of their hollow home, it was something far darker. When she married her grandson, the last fragile veil was torn away. The family could no longer pretend they were just eccentric or just private or just poor mountain folk keeping to themselves. What they had done was laid bare in front of everyone, generation upon generation of inbreeding, culminating in the unholy union that would seal their fate forever. And yet, if you look closely, you'll see that the story is not only about a single family. It is about how communities allow secrets to rot in their soil, how neighbors learn to look away, how silence becomes complicity. Because the real question is not just why she married her grandson, it's why no one stopped her. The marriage was not the beginning, it was the end of something much older. To understand how it came to be, you have to go back nearly 100 years, to the hills where this family first laid its roots. These weren't townspeople with shops or trades. They lived on the fringes, deep in the woods, in sagging houses where children outnumbered chairs and silence filled the air like smoke. The bloodline started with a man who believed in purity, but not the kind you read about in holy books. He believed that to marry outside the family was to invite corruption, that outsiders brought disease, greed, and betrayal. So he married his cousin and taught his children to do the same. By the time the next generation came of age, there was no difference between brother and cousin, between niece and daughter. The family tree didn't grow, it folded in on itself, each branch bending back toward the trunk. Over time, their features began to tell the story that words could not. Faces that looked eerily alike, voices that echoed each other in pitch and tone, a strange slowness of thought that neighbors noticed but never spoke about directly. When the family came into town for supplies, storekeepers whispered after them. Children pointed, and yet no one intervened. In rural America, privacy was sacred, and what a family did behind their walls was considered their own business. But blood remembers. It remembers every mistake, every twisted bond, every child born of a union that never should have been. Doctors began to notice illnesses they couldn't explain, deformities that didn't match medical textbooks. When asked about fathers and mothers, the family would shrug or laugh or simply say, "It don't matter," and perhaps to them, it truly didn't. By the time the woman who would one day marry her grandson was born, she was already carrying the weight of choices made long before her. She grew up in a house where doors were locked, where girls disappeared into bedrooms with men who shared their last name, where shame was not acknowledged because it was simply the way things were. So when the day came that she stood beside her grandson at the altar, it was not a shock to the family. To them, it was almost expected. The cycle had gone on so long that the unnatural had become natural, But for the town watching, it was like glimpsing the final stage of a disease that had been spreading silently for generations. The wedding was small, but it was unforgettable. There were no church bells, no grand procession, just a quiet ceremony on a patch of worn grass with a preacher who seemed more nervous than holy. The bride wore a dress that had been used before. Some said it belonged to her mother, others whispered it had been hers from her first marriage. The groom, barely grown into manhood, stood stiff beside her, his eyes not of a husband, but of a child caught in something he could not escape. Guests sat silently, as though they were watching a play that had been rehearsed for decades. No one laughed, no one clapped. They just watched, and in their watching, they became witnesses to the collapse of a bloodline. The whispers started immediately. "That's her grandson. They can't be serious. Why doesn't someone stop this?" But the truth is, by then, it was too late. This was a family that had been left to its own devices for too long, allowed to wall itself off from the world until the world no longer had the courage to interfere. Neighbors would later admit that they knew something was wrong years before the wedding. They saw children barefoot in the dead of winter, faces pale and blank, eyes that didn't focus quite right. They heard strange noises at night, carried on the wind from the hollow, and they noticed how rarely anyone in that family seemed to leave the property unless it was absolutely necessary. Yet fear held their tongues, fear of confrontation, fear of what they might uncover if they pried too deeply. The marriage was more than a scandal. It was a revelation. It revealed not just the family's secrets, but the community's silence. Everyone who had turned a blind eye, everyone who had shrugged and said, "That's just how they are," now had to reckon with the truth. This was not just oddity. This was not just poverty. This was decay, a generational rot that no one dared to name until it stood before them in the form of a bride and her grandson groom. For some, the wedding was a grotesque curiosity, a story to whisper over drinks. But for others, it was something darker, a warning. Because if this could happen here in plain sight, what other horrors might be hidden behind the curtains of other families, in other towns, in other forgotten corners of America? After the wedding, the house they lived in became less a home and more a tomb. The walls seemed to absorb the silence, the weight of every secret pressing in like damp earth on a coffin. Neighbors who passed by described the place as wrong, as if the very structure carried the sickness of what had occurred inside it. Windows were covered, doors rarely opened, and the family seemed to vanish deeper into themselves. The woman, now both grandmother and wife, aged quickly after the marriage. Some said she grew pale, her eyes hollow, her body frail. Others said she carried herself with a strange, unsettling pride, as though what she had done was not shame but legacy. She spoke less and less to outsiders, and when she did, her words were often cryptic, almost rehearsed, like lines from an old prayer she couldn't forget. The boy she married, her grandson, fared worse. Townsfolk recalled seeing him walking alone, muttering under his breath, sometimes laughing at nothing, sometimes screaming into the night. He seemed torn between the roles forced upon him: child, husband, victim, heir. His life was not his own, and yet the blood in his veins bound him to a destiny he never chose. Stories began to spread, of strange cries echoing from the house at night, of infants born and buried before they ever reached a year, of the ground behind the home being dug and filled again, until the earth itself seemed restless, disturbed. No official records confirmed these rumors, but in small towns, absence of proof often means something far worse than proof itself. And yet, the family continued. They endured in silence, as they always had, until the line blurred completely between endurance and curse. The marriage became the final chapter of a book no one wanted to read, a grotesque seal closing over a century of hidden unions. When outsiders stumbled upon the story, newcomers who hadn't grown up with the unspoken rules, they often asked, why didn't anyone stop them? But those who lived nearby knew the truth. The family was never just one family. They were a mirror, reflecting back the cowardice of an entire community. To intervene would mean admitting what had been allowed to fester all those years. To stop it would mean confessing that silence is not innocence, it is complicity. Time has a strange way of erasing details but leaving behind shadows. Ask anyone in the county today and they'll tell you half-truths about that family. Some say the marriage never happened. Others swear they saw it with their own eyes. A few will shut down completely, insisting they don't remember, when in reality they remember everything. The silence has become its own kind of folklore, an unspoken pact to bury the truth beneath layers of rumor and denial. But the ground never forgets. Old foundations still stand in the hollow, rotting wood and rusted metal, sagging under the weight of memory. If you walk there at dusk, locals warn, you can feel the air shift. It's heavy, damp, almost metallic, as though the land itself resents what was done upon it. Hunters avoid the area. Teenagers dare each other to go at night, only to come back pale and shaken, refusing to talk about what they heard. Generations later, descendants of the bloodline still exist, but they are scattered, hidden, changed. Some moved away, marrying into new families, trying desperately to outrun the stain of their heritage. Others remained in the shadows of those same woods, clinging to secrecy like armor. Traces of the past linger in their faces, in the eerily familiar eyes and jawlines that echo back to the first patriarch who started it all. And this is where the story shifts from disturbing history to something more personal. Because every listener, every viewer, is forced to ask, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have run from it, pretended it didn't exist? Or would you have faced it head-on, risking the shame, the exile, the wrath of a family bound by silence? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because stories like this don't survive just because of the people who lived them. They survive because others chose to look away. And maybe that's the part that unsettles us the most. It isn't only about them, it's about us, the hidden corners of our own families, the secrets buried in basements and attics, the things we choose not to ask about when an older relative cuts the story short and says, "That's enough." The Inbred family's final secret is not just theirs, it is a mirror showing us what silence makes possible. The deeper you look into the family's story, the harder it becomes to separate fact from nightmare. Records vanish, birth certificates are missing, marriage licenses are incomplete or never filed. It's as if the paper trail itself recoiled from documenting what should never have been. But oral histories remain, passed in low whispers at kitchen tables, and they paint a picture far more chilling than any official archive ever could. According to some, the woman's marriage to her grandson was not an accident of circumstance, but a deliberate act. It was spoken of within the family as keeping the blood whole, the final vow in a chain of unions stretching back more than a century. To them, outsiders were contamination. To them, love was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was preservation. Preservation at any cost. But there was another layer to it. Some claim she believed the bloodline itself carried a kind of curse, one that demanded loyalty even in its most grotesque form. She told relatives that to break the chain would invite ruin, that the family would wither if anyone dared to marry beyond their walls. And in a way she wasn't wrong, because when the bloodline finally did break, when children began leaving, marrying strangers, diluting the old heritage, the family's power collapsed. Within a generation, the once feared, once whispered about name dissolved into obscurity. Still, the marriage stands as the symbol of its end, a grotesque monument to secrecy and silence. And what followed was even darker. Strange illnesses swept through the house, infants born without breath, surviving children who carried marks that seemed less medical and more biblical, as though the sins of their ancestors were carved into their skin. Townsfolk spoke of hearing wailing at night, cries that didn't sound fully human. Others swore they saw figures moving in the windows long after the house had been abandoned. What is certain is that after the marriage, the family began to vanish. Some died quietly, others disappeared, others left and refused to speak of their past. By the time county officials investigated, there was almost nothing left. Just rotting walls, scattered belongings, and a graveyard of unmarked stones behind the property. The final secret may not be the marriage itself, but what the marriage revealed, that some families do not simply die out. They consume themselves until there is nothing left but shadows and silence. And so, the story ends where it began, in silence. The house is gone now, swallowed by weeds and trees, the forest slowly reclaiming what was once a stage for unspeakable acts. The family name, once infamous in whispered conversations, has dissolved into the soil, remembered only by the few who still dare to speak it. Outsiders pass through the area without knowing what once stood there. They see nothing but broken earth and tangled roots. But those who remember, they feel it. Because some stains don't wash away. They linger in the land, in the blood, in the memory of those who tried to bury them. And this family's final secret was never just about a marriage. It was about what happens when silence festers long enough to become culture. When shame becomes inheritance. When the line between protection and complicity disappears entirely. The woman who married her grandson became more than a scandal. She became the final chapter of her family's story. A chapter no one wanted written, but one that revealed everything. The decay of tradition, the danger of isolation, and the terrible price of secrets carried for too long. Her decision wasn't born in a single moment. It was the echo of a century of choices, each one narrowing the path until there was only one direction left. Today, when people speak of her, they do so cautiously. Some call her wicked. Others pity her as a victim born into chains she never forged, but never broke. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle, between guilt and survival, between choice and inevitability. And maybe that's why her story unsettles us so deeply, because it forces us to ask how much of who we are is chosen, and how much is simply carried down, in silence, from those who came before. So the next time you hear someone laugh about strange families hidden away in the mountains, remember this: not all stories are folklore. Some are re-warnings, some are graves without markers, and some are too real to ever fully fade. Thank you for watching. If this story haunted you, make sure to like and subscribe so you never miss the hidden histories that others are too afraid to tell. And if you've heard whispers like this in your own hometown, leave a comment. Because sometimes the past isn't just behind us. Sometimes it's still here, waiting, just beneath the surface.